Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students. In the previous lecture we discussed the teaching methods in brief. We discussed most of the methodologies that are used in vogue in brief. In today's lecture we will be discussing two of the most important methods in detail. The first one is the grammar translation method and the second one is the direct method. Before we start with the grammar translation method, a bit of a history of this GTM. Uh, 500 years ago, Latin was used in religion, government, and trade. However, in the 16th century, French, Italian, and English became dominant in spoken and written communication. As Latin transitioned from being a language heard in the streets into a language subject, studying it took on a different logic. Whereas before it was learned for the purposes of communication, studying Latin became an intellectual pursuit instead. Uh, Latin was a language which was used for in religion, in government, and trade back in the history. With the passage of time, when new languages like the French and Italian and English they became dominant, the use of Latin was limited, and language the use of Latin language as a language of communication changed to um, an academic purpose. It was confined. Uh, Latin language became a sign of intellect and learnedness. It was like if you would quote something in Latin, that would mean that people would assume you as a very learned and sophisticated person, educated person. So it was confined. Now, the grammar translation method became the system used to teach these dead languages. Dead languages mean languages which were not used for communication in routine life and in daily life, or which were confined. So, these languages were taught through the grammar translation method for academic and intellectual purposes. Because nobody spoke it in daily affairs, proper pronunciation, diction, etc. were not the marching orders of the day. Pronunciations and dictions, they were not important. What was important was to learn the language. And why? Because it was used for what? For knowing things which were written in that very language in the past. You wouldn't be using it to buy apples at the market in any case. Only what was written by those who used it previously mattered. So the writings, the works of those writers in the past who used Latin language for their works, that was important, and Latin language was learned for the sole purpose of understanding those things. So the method focused on developing students' reading and writing abilities. Things which this GTM focused on was enhancing these reading and writing abilities of the students, of the learners. So language learning mattered little outside the walls of academia. Outside academic purposes, language was not important. Language learning was not important because the function of learning such dead languages was to know the works which were written in that very language in the past. Now, the principles and goals of grammar translation method. There are two main goals to grammar translation classes. One is to develop students' reading ability to a level where they can read literature in the target language. The other is to develop students' general mental discipline. So, in grammar translation method, the first and the most important purpose is to make to enable the reader or the learner to be able to read literature in the target language, so that when the learner he tries to read something in that very target language, be it Latin, be it English, whatever language it is, the learner should be able to understand the literature of that language, the books written in that language, whatever comes across. So it was confined for this academic purpose. Users of foreign language want to note things of their interest in the literature of foreign languages. So therefore, this method focuses on reading and writing and has developed techniques which facilitate more or less the learning of reading and writing only. So this grammar translation method, the only fields where it could help the learner is reading and writing. As a result, speaking and listening are overlooked. So the flaw in grammar translation method is that the learner does not get an opportunity of communicating in that language. So it is not a practical use of the language, rather it focuses on reading and writing, understanding a target language without practical use of that language. This was the flaw in that very language. Now the method of this GTM or grammar translation method is that classes are usually conducted in the students' native languages. The target language is not used in the class. For example, if you students are taught English as a second language and we use the grammar translation method, so we will not be using English language in the classroom, rather we will be using our own native language, be it Pashto or be it Urdu. So we will be using our own language. Grammatical rules are learned deductively. Students learn grammar rules and then practice the rules by doing grammar drills and translating sentences to and from the target language, which we discussed in our class also, is that grammar is focused upon. If we look at the case here in our country, we also start with the basic grammar, the tenses, then the parts of speech and the tenses, and then direct and indirect and active passive. So we focus on the grammar and the structure of the target language, and also translations, which is part and parcel of our academic books or other materials. More attention is paid to the form of the sentences being translated than their content. So emphasis or stress is laid on the form of the sentence, the grammar, the syntax of the sentence rather than the content. When students reach more advanced levels of achievement, they may translate entire texts from the target language. So with the help of this grammar translation method, the way it helps students is that they are enabled to understand the target language, a passage, any text in the target language, and then accordingly translate the same into their own language. Tests often involve translating classical texts. So even in tests, you find these questions where translations are required. There is usually no listening or speaking practice, and very little attention is placed on pronunciation or any communicative aspects of the language. The same thing that language is used only for academic purposes, and there is no focus or emphasis on listening or speaking, meaning thereby that when speaking and listening they are not focused on, automatically pronunciation will be poor, and the way language is used for communication, for general normal communication, that cannot be achieved because we have confined ourselves to the academic use. The skill exercise is reading, and then only in the context of translation. Even if we read it for a translation, and that is the reason that GTM or the grammar translation method, it does not enhance the communicative use of the target language, because we do not use it for general communication. So the method here is again continuing. How in classroom we use the mother tongue in the grammar translation method. Vocabulary items are taught in the form of word lists. Words are underlined, lists are made, important significant words are pointed out, and that is way to develop the vocabulary of a learner. Elaborate explanations of grammar. Grammar is discussed in detail, the basic rules and structures are discussed in detail. Focus on morphology and syntax, again the same thing, where structure is emphasized. Reading of difficult texts in the course, in the target language, Suppose if we are learning language, difficult texts, we are given difficult texts to read in our classroom. Practice focuses on exercises, translating sentences or text from mother tongue to the target language and vice versa. Two-way translation from target language to the native language and from the mother tongue to the target language. These are the exercises, these are the methods that are applied in the grammar translation method. Now let's discuss the advantages of this grammar translation method. The first one, translation is the easiest and shortest way of explaining meaning of words and phrases. Oh, because target language is not the mother tongue or the native language. So when we translate the target language into our native or mother tongue, it becomes easy and the shortest way of explaining words and phrases. When a word is translated into our native language or our mother tongue, it is very much easy for us to understand. Then learners have no difficulty to understand the lesson as it is carried out in the mother tongue. The same thing that when target language is taught in your mother tongue, you will have no difficulties in understanding whatever is being taught. It is a labor-saving method as the teacher carries out everything in the mother tongue. I am teaching English, but I do not use English in my classroom, and I teach the same thing in the native language, be it Pashto, be it Urdu, whatever your mother tongue is, we will use that language to teach the target language. And this thing is very much helpful for the learners of the target language because the target language is translated into their own mother tongue. Now the criticism on this grammar translation method. Let's see what are the drawbacks or the flaws that have been pointed out about this method. The first one, what the method is good at is teaching about the language and not teaching the language itself. Meaning thereby that if we use our mother tongue for the target language, this does not amount to teaching the target language, rather it is teaching about the language, because critics say that if we are learning, let's say, English language, so that if we are not using that language for our communicative purposes, how could we say that we are learning this language? So in the grammar translation method, because we use our native tongue, our mother tongue, and we use our mother tongue to talk about a different language, a target language, so it is teaching about the language and not teaching the language. The first criticism, which is very much well founded. If we are learning English language and we are not using the target language in the classroom for communication, for expressing yourself, for expressing general things, routine life things, the way normal people use language for communication, if we do not do it, how are we supposed to learn our language? We cannot say that we will learn English in Urdu because this is what we do in grammar translation method. So the first criticism is that grammar translation method is teaching about the language and not teaching the language. With a very well-founded criticism on the grammar translation method. Second is that speaking or any kind of spontaneous creative output was missing from the curriculum. Again, the same thing, that if we mean to learn a language, why not communicate in that very language? That is a spontaneous creative output. If I'm teaching English and I ask you, I communicate with you in your mother tongue, let's say Pashto or Urdu, how are you supposed to know about the practical use of the target language, that is English language? So this thing was missing in the grammar translation method. The next was that students lacked an active role in the classroom, because students were not supposed to use the target language. Teaching and communication is normally done in the mother tongue in the grammar translation method. So the active role of student, it was missing. When very little attention is paid to communication, the same thing that we have discussed earlier, that we do not use the language for communication. And then very little attention is paid to the content. As we said, that emphasis is laid on the form and syntax rather than the content. Because in translation, focus is laid on the form. Translation is sometimes misleading. Again, a very well-founded criticism that in translation sometimes thoughts are not as properly translated or interpreted the way they are in the target language. Then, because of all these disadvantages, instructors try to find better ways to remedy the pitfalls of the grammar translation method. So, after all the analysis of the grammar translation method, they came up with what? The direct method. The direct method was the answer to all these points that we discussed in criticism. Now let's see what the direct method of teaching actually is. The method direct is named direct because meaning should be connected directly with the target language without translation into the native language. If we are to learn a target language, we should use that very language without translations the way we do in grammar translation method. So, in other words, is that in direct teaching method, whatever we do in the classroom, we use the target language. That is, only English is used. Suppose if we are learning English language through the direct method, so the only language that we will be using in the class would be the target language, that is English. A lot of students dialogues, later systematic thinking of grammar and vocabulary. Initially, what they start with is a lot of teacher-students dialogues. They communicate in the classroom in the target language. They use language as it is used in daily life, and later on, systematic teaching of grammar and vocabulary is concentrated on as importance is given to that. The direct teaching method is a method of foreign and second language teaching, which consists that only the target language should be used in the class, and meaning should be communicated directly by associating speech forms with action, objects, gestures, and situations. Mime, gesture, and situations. Mime means gesture or your facial expressions. So, in the direct teaching method, we use the target language for actual communication inside the class. The direct method has one very basic rule: no translation is allowed. So, in contrast to the grammar translation method, in direct method, we do not use any kind of translation. In fact, the direct method receives its name from the fact that meaning is to be connected directly with the English language without going through the process of translating it into the student's native language. So, words and ideas, they are transformed to the students in the target language rather than translating them into their native language. They are confronted with things, with ideas, with expressions that they use directly in the target language. And so the characteristics of direct method of teaching English. The direct method of teaching English is one of the most widely known methods. It enjoyed immense popularity because it overcame the two major defects of the GTM. It substituted language content for grammar recitation and language use for translation. So, instead of grammar recitation and translation, which we did in the grammar translation method, this direct method introduced what? Language context and language use. So the practical use of language was possible through the direct method. Then emphasis on oral language. Oral language, the way language is used in speaking and daily communication. Intensive speech practice, usually with training in phonetics. Emphasis is given importance or focus is, is paid on the phonetics, on the pronunciations, the way language is spoken. So the new language or the target language is used exclusively in the classroom. Mm, It is hopefully expected that by banishing the native language from the classroom, the students would be compelled to do their thinking in the new medium. Once you ban a native language or the mother tongue in the classroom, the students will be left with no other option but to use the target language. So this will enable the students to exercise their own uh, abilities, their own thoughts, their own mental abilities to express themselves in the target language. And the learner experiences the new language in the same way as he has experienced his mother tongue. So the way a learner initially learns his mother language, in the same way in the direct method, the target language is learned exactly like the mother tongue. Now the aims of direct method of teaching. The direct method aims at establishing a direct bond between experience and expression. You experience something and then you express. So they say that there should be a direct bond. The way you experience it, you should be able to express it. According to the direct method, the students should think directly in English. What normally happens is that when you start using the target language, the second language or the target language, first you have those thoughts in your mind in your native language, say Pashto or Urdu. You translate those thoughts in your mind and then you use the target language. This direct method say that thinking should be done in the target language, that is English, and then that there should be no intervention of the mother tongue in the translation method. The students comes across a sentence in the English language, let's say there is E, and then he immediately thinks of its native language equivalent, say N, and then he thinks of the idea or the concept underlying that sentence. E is somebody tells you something, a sentence, right? This what happens is that you convert this sentence into your native language, you translate it, and then after translation you get the concept behind this sentence E. So this involves translation of the target language into your native language and then grasping the concept behind that sentence. E stands for the English language, N for the native language, and C for the concept. In the direct method, there is no intervention of the native language, so the link is that the thought of the sentence is directly translated and you get the concept from the sentence or the ideas that have been expressed. So it is not translated into your mother tongue. And this is developed through practice. It could only be mastered once you start using a target language for communicative purposes rather than translating a target language into your mother tongue and then getting the concept. The direct method aims at developing an instinctive, unerring language sense in the people. So this method aims at developing an unmistakable language sense in the people. So it aims at developing the capability of a student that he should be able to think in the target language and then express himself in the target language without any intervention of the mother tongue. Principles of direct method in teaching English. There are certain principles. Reading in the target language should be taught from the beginning of the language instruction. However, reading skill will be developed through practice with speaking. Language is primarily speech. In direct method, reading is to be taught from the very beginning because language is speaking. It is through speaking and using the language that you learn a language. Then objects, which may include realia or pictures present in the immediate classroom environment, should be used to help students understand the meanings. We should be using objects which may include realia or which may include pictures, and they should be made available in the classroom in order to help the students understand the meanings of those ideas. What is realia? Realia in English is a foreign language term, refers to any real objects we use in the classroom to bring the class to life. So if we use real objects to demonstrate ideas, it helps the students to grasp the language quickly. And the native language should not be used in the classroom. In direct method, we should never be using our mother tongue or the native language. It is discouraged. The teacher should demonstrate, not explain or translate. Rather than explaining things or translating, the teacher should be demonstrating, practically showing to the students in the target language. It is desirable that students make a direct association between target language and meaning. Ideas should be presented in the target language rather than translating them in their mother tongue or in their native language. So instead of translation, the students should be confronted, should be made, there should be a direct confrontation of the learner with the objects in the target language. And students should learn to think in the target language as soon as possible. Vocabulary is acquired more naturally if students use it in full sentences rather than memorizing. Uh, आप लोगों ने अक्सर देखा होगा कि we memorize meanings of words. We look up in dictionary and then we try to memorize it. This thing makes it very much difficult to remember and then retain those words in memory. In direct method, what happens is that students are encouraged to use those words in sentences in context. It is not only the meaning of the word, but also the use of the word, which is very much important. That the learner should know how a word is used in a sentence and how it works. Now let's discuss the advantages of direct method. So the first one, direct method helps learner to acquire correct pronunciation. The way language is spoken or used in communication, direct method helps in acquiring that one. And it provides better understanding, it is time saving, it helps in teaching idioms because once you use language the way it is used practically, you would definitely be using idiomatic expressions because the natives they do use, and it provides better fluency of language rather than using the language in a bookish way. It in direct method you become fluent in the use of the language because you do not confine yourself to textbooks or texts. It is based on psychological principle, no gap between active and passive vocabularies. So these are the advantages. Vocabularies that you active and passive vocabularies, passive that you are being taught, like the way we use in grammar translation methods, and you are forced to or you are compelled to learn something. That is your passive vocabulary. And active is when you use words knowing their meanings and knowing the use of those words. So in direct method, there is no gap between these two because you are actively involved in the practical use of the language. I have included some other uh, advantages of the direct method in your lecture, which you would be studying by yourself. I'll be discussing the disadvantages of the direct method of teaching. Now, the few disadvantages are a direct method may be difficult as there is no use of the mother language. For initial learners or for weaker students, it might be difficult, the direct method. It isn't economical as it requires various teaching aids. It is not economical because, as we said, that using realia and things which might practically demonstrate things, so that might be costly. It may not be suitable for average or weaker students. It requires competent teachers because if you have to use the direct method, the teachers must be competent enough to use the language the way it is used by the native speakers of that language. Then it gives emphasis on listening and speaking skills. Again, it isn't effective in early stages of learning. So if a learner is in the beginning, if he's the initial learner of the language, so this direct method might not be effective for that early learner of the language. So that is all.